Today, the contemporary Western consensus views the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as an erratic, terror-driven rogue state. A forensic review of the historical record points to a different conclusion. Their nuclear posture operates as a highly rationalized intergenerational trauma response. Between 2 and 3 million Korean civilians were killed over 3 years of conflict. For North Korea specifically, that casualty rate reached 12 to 15% of its total population. This demographic loss matches or exceeds the Soviet Union's losses during the entirety of World War II. Understanding the geopolitical reality of modern nuclear threats requires auditing the forgotten American extermination campaign that functionally birthed the current North Korean state. These immense casualty figures stand in stark contrast to the absolute lack of strategic or territorial gain achieved by the conflict. The war ended exactly where it began, at the 38th parallel. The peninsula remains divided, and technically, 70 years later, still at war. The operation was officially labeled a police action. The raw logistical data reveals it as the industrial-scale incineration of a nation's people and infrastructure. This conflict established a new operational model for the defense industry, scaling military production into a significant driver of the national economy and wealth transfer. The U.S. government sent thousands of young men to die in a country they never knew, securing a result that changed absolutely nothing geographically. The label of the Forgotten War serves to obscure the details of the campaign, leaving the American public disconnected from the strategic vacuum of the 3-year slaughter. The air campaign was defined by massive logistical asymmetry. American planes dropped 635,000 tons of guns on a peninsula, more tonnage than was used in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. The infrastructural erasure was absolute. They documented destroying 8,700 factories, over 1,000 civilian hospitals, and systematically stamping out 78 cities. Look at the structural flattening of Pyongyang in 1953, contrasted with its modern, rebuilt state. Only 2 modern buildings remained standing in the capital at the end of the war. North Korea was forced to rebuild from a baseline of 0, reconstructing its entire urban fabric from the rubble. The claim of precision bombing is directly contradicted by the command staff. Air Force General Curtis LeMay openly admitted the goal, stating, "We went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea." The targeting expanded to the food supply. Bombers deliberately struck the Toksan and Chosan dams while new rice was being planted, causing catastrophic flooding to destroy the essential harvest. 13 hydroelectric facilities were bombed in June 1952, knocking out all power in North Korea. Civilians were left freezing in the dark for weeks, unable to heat their homes or cook their food. The United States officially defines terrorism as the deliberate targeting of civilians for political purposes. Executing a systemic attack on life-sustaining infrastructure is state-sponsored famine. It is the literal weaponization of agricultural and energy supply against a captive civilian population. The abstraction of aerial bombing obscures the intimate reality of the ground troop operations. In the town of Sinchon, American and Allied forces committed a mass murder of civilians over 52 days. Roughly 1/4 of the town's entire population was systematically executed. In July 1950, American troops spent 3 days firing on women and children sheltering under a bridge. Bullet holes still scar the concrete at No Gunry. Firing on refugees was not an isolated breakdown of discipline. Declassified diplomatic letters from the U.S. ambassador confirmed the Army had officially adopted a policy of firing on approaching civilian groups. The campaign was driven by a documented racist ideology, where the military establishment officially treated Oriental lives as having less value than Western lives. A South Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission eventually found over 200 cases of U.S. forces strafing refugee gatherings in 1950 and 1951 alone. Despite North Korea's well-documented reputation for viciousness, historians conclude that U.S. soldiers engaged in more civilian massacres than their enemy. The American response bypassed the proportionality of defensive warfare and operated entirely as a localized extermination campaign against civilians. How did an American public that had just defeated the extermination camps of Nazi Germany come to support this? The Truman and Eisenhower administrations built a rigorous domestic propaganda architecture, framing the conflict strictly in terms of freedom versus tyranny. The American media functioned as an active participant, suppressing facts about free fire zones and describing the indiscriminate slaughter of the air campaign as surgical. Calling it the Forgotten War was a deliberate psychological outcome. The public was shielded from the shame of the campaign by actively erasing it from the national dialogue. By racializing the enemy, the media ensured that the American public responded to 3 million dead Koreans with a collective shrug. The population was lied to. They were fed a sanitized narrative so the economic and military architects of the war could operate with total impunity. A macroeconomic audit of the war reveals exactly who profited from a zero-sum stalemate. This chart plots defense contractor stock valuations, like Lockheed and Boeing, during the war. Valuations spiked directly in response to events indicating continued hostilities. Conversely, every time news of potential peace emerged, these stocks dropped negatively. Corporate profitability was mathematically dependent on continued slaughter. This corporate windfall was subsidized by the American working class. The operation extracted the equivalent of $300 billion modern dollars from the public. The domestic economic fallout was swift. The national debt spiked, and an inflationary spiral caused the dollar's purchasing power to reach an all-time low of 59 cents. The conflict doubled military spending as a share of the economy, taking it from 7.5% to 16% of the GDP. This established the permanent military-industrial complex, a massive, entrenched constituency that requires constant conflict to survive. Today, South Korea acts as a permanent hardware market, paying billions to defense firms like Lockheed Martin for fighter jets. The 28,500 American troops still stationed on the peninsula do not function purely for stability. They maintain the geopolitical justification for this perpetual defense spending. The American taxpayer financed their own economic degradation to bankroll the slaughter of millions and enrich a permanent war machine. Industrial-scale campaigns against civilian populations, the deliberate targeting of cities, and the weaponization of racist ideology perfectly describe the operations of Nazi Germany. They also describe American operations in Korea. The functional difference is that the victor controls the historiography. What is prosecuted as genocide in Nuremberg is rebranded as the fog of war in Washington. General Douglas MacArthur proposed dropping 34 atomic bombs to create a permanent belt of radioactive cobalt across Manchuria. He returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. The United States labels North Korea a rogue state today, ignoring that the U.S. executed the defining characteristics of a terrorist regime on the peninsula during the 1950s. By relying on the engineered indifference of its public, the United States continues to commit atrocities it would explicitly define as genocide if done by any other nation. Dropping 635,000 tons of bombs did not break the DPRK. Instead, it forced their civilization to militarize underground. While the American public was taught to forget, North Korea institutionalized the memory. Every schoolchild is taught the exact history of the bombing campaigns and the massacres. Their pursuit of nuclear weapons is a highly rational survival mechanism birthed directly from the trauma of near-total demographic erasure. The Korean War never ended, lives on in the divided peninsula, in every underground nuclear test, and in every billion-dollar defense contract. The U.S. remains locked in a standoff with a nuclear-armed state it functionally created through demographic erasure, paralyzed until it finally audits its atrocities.